start streaming here. And check the attendance. May just be YouTube. Let's check it out. You guys are B, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, it's YouTube, and then Justin Isaac. Justin Isaac should be here. So we'll see if he shows up. For Wednesday. Because I think I only have you on Monday and Wednesday. Yeah.
No, I will have you Monday, and then Tuesday only here for 2 days.
You're here, but yes, but for my class, remember it's 135. And so I'll see you in class physically only on Monday. You'll still be here on Tuesday, but you won't have my class on Tuesday. Justin Isaac, I presume. Very good. Well. So, welcome. This is pretty much how we're going to do things in here. I am streaming right now on YouTube so that those kids that are not here can hear the second half of what we talked about this morning. Just to fill you in a little bit here. What we did this morning was talked about 19th century society, the Victorian era, talking about social changes that happen, things relating to families, things relating to types of jobs that people were getting in the middle class, which is growing at this time, and what else? Changes in child rearing practices, changes in what else did we talk about? It's actually on this computer behind me. In fact, I don't know if these will pop up. Let's do this. So, what else did we talk about? Changing family dynamics. Kind of just those kinds of things. I've pretty much covered it. A little bit about migration, but mostly child rearing, family sorts of things. And then finished it up by talking about this thing called the Belle Epoque, or epic. This should pop on in just a second here. Hopefully, yeah, there we go. From current slide. Okay. So, talking a little bit more about this period of time, basically you're seeing an increase. We're entering into, in the second half of the 19th century, it's something called the age of mass politics. Okay, age of mass politics. And what this basically is referring to is how, I guess the best way I can describe it is, even though the Industrial Revolution brought us closer to what we understand to be the world today, it really wasn't until the end of the 19th century that the world started to take a shape that's more similar to what it is today. So industrialization had been around for a while by this point, but when we get to the 1890s, we see changes in science, changes in like art and literature and philosophy and psychology and physics. And these changes in this period of time, like right at the tail end of the 1800s, at the start of the 1900s, the 20th century, is when we finally start to see a world that resembles, at least, something a little closer to what we see today. One of the things that's so weird, it freaks me out, is that when you look at the end of World War I, the end of World War I brought with it the end of what had been hundreds of years of dynastical rule by empires, right? You had the Russian Empire, you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you had the German Empire, and you had the Ottoman Empire, and all four of them collapsed at the end of World War I, which for your intents and purposes, you kids were born in the 21st century, may as well have been 1,000,000 years ago. But in reality, we're talking about World War I ended 103 years ago. It's really not that long of a time in the grand scheme of things, 100 years, a century. So even if you were to take a time machine back 100 years to the Belle Epoque, which, to be honest with you, even though it gets nicknamed the good old days, back in the, like, folks after World War I, they used to remember the times before World War I as the good old days. Remember that that's pretty Euro and male and white centric. I would not imagine that most women or African Americans at this time, for example, or colonial Africans living under European rule, thought of this period as the good old days, right? Because probably it was pretty miserable for a lot of them. But nonetheless, during this time, we are seeing a growing middle class. I don't want you to confuse growing middle class with like lessening of the gap between the rich and the poor, though, because at this time, even though we're seeing more people in industrialized nations enter into what we call the middle class these days, which, if we talk about like the bourgeoisie or the middle class. If you want a prime example of bourgeoisie, just take a walk around Eastvale, okay? Because it's pretty much as bourgeois as it gets. You're not nobles. You don't have titles like, Duke of whatever or Duchess of so on. But you have these relatively large homes in a very well-manicured area with open parks and other things like that. These are middle-class luxuries. The vast majority of the world, I probably don't have to tell you, does not live in these kinds of conditions here in the Eastvale bubble. And the problems associated with the middle class are going to be different than problems of the poorer classes. Now, today in the United States, it is true that if we're looking on a global level, here in the United States, most people in the United States we would designate as middle class. What does that really mean? I think that, it can be a little bit difficult. Let me see if I can, I really screwed this up first period. Let me see if I can remember how to do this, because it's been a while since I've used this guy. But let's do this. There's a way to draw on this. Is it this? That's it. Okay. Okay. So the way that most people think about the middle class is like, if this was society right here, like this is everybody in society, you have like a few people at the very top who are like upper class, you have a few people at the bottom who are like working class, and then you have this nice, big, healthy group of people in the middle that are called middle class, right? That's how most people, if you were to ask people in the United States, like how is the breakdown of society by class, this is probably something that they would come up with. But to be honest with you, this is not really how it is. When you really look at wealth distribution in the United States, there's a tremendous number of people, we'll say, that make around, we'll say annually, maybe, I'm just guessing, but if you take California into consideration, I'm going to guess around $50,000 a year or less, okay? Individual income, not household income. And that's the vast majority of people, who we would then designate as working class. People who literally, like, if they stopped working that week, would be without any money, right? Because they're living paycheck to paycheck. Then you've got this group of people who we will ostensibly call the middle class, right? Who make somewhere between, let's say, in California, these numbers are going to be a little higher, but I'm seeing nationally here. So we'll say between about 50,000 to, we'll say about 200,000, okay, who are middle class. And then you have like the wealthy, right, who make a lot of money. But the idea being here that this is just for the US, right? Interestingly enough, even many of these working class folks in the United States would still be on a global level designated as middle class. because of the fact that there are like globally 2 billion people on the planet that are living on less than $2 a day. So we are seeing during this time more people entering into this kind of middle class, maybe lower middle class segment of the economy, and this means that they have more money to go and spend on things and more leisure time. And that's exactly, when we think about leisure time here in the United States, and I got up, no one was watching me, they're just watching my desk here, but let me see if this is still streaming. Yeah, we're good. Okay. So, so here in the United States, on your off time, why do you work? Why do people get jobs in the United States? Just tell me that. Why do you work for a living in the United States? Yeah. And what do you use the money on? Yeah. Yeah. Support yourself, buy stuff, right? And so and you have a pretty great degree of freedom of what you choose to spend your money on for the most part. COVID has been weird, but I think it's weird that you guys are young and going through COVID, like as kids, and not as adults. Because for me, COVID is very, I think, people are going to be thinking about COVID as like, oh, before COVID and after COVID. It's one of those like period marking events. So it'll be interesting to see how the world changes after COVID, or if it doesn't change very much. Like 9/11 is one of those other events, right? That's what happened when I was about your guys. It's a little older than you when 9/11 happened. I was a senior in high school, and of course it's kind of set into motion this generation of about 20 years, and now COVID's like, I think, like the new marker. But during COVID, we haven't been able to go and use our money in the ways that we normally would, but you can go and see sports games or concerts or other things like that. The beginnings of those kinds of things, going to athletic events, seeing soccer teams play and so on, started because the middle class was widening and looking for more things to spend their money on. So we talked a little bit about that this morning, but just recapping some of this stuff now. And then cafes and taverns, restaurants, that's like one of the big things that's been hard on businesses. Lots and lots of restaurant businesses have gone under since COVID. But then, it's funny, truly smart people probably would have been able to make a fortune on COVID, or have already made a fortune on COVID, by predicting the businesses that would do well with COVID. Like, for example, Amazon, right? Even though Amazon was already huge before COVID, it has only gotten huger since COVID, because of how many people don't want to leave their houses to purchase stuff and then they have it sent to the house. UPS, anything dealing with delivery would have been a good choice, or FedEx or anything like that. But all right, and then we talked about some new inventions this morning in first period. I did cover this morning, so I'm going to skip over that. Telephone, automobile, record player, things like that. Education is kind of where we left off this morning. So talking just a little bit about compulsory education. So I mentioned that this period of time in the latter half of the 19th century is often referred to as the age of mass politic. And when we think about like the masses, that's really where we're getting that term. So mass participation in government starts to become a thing. And one of the reasons that the government has a vested interest at this time in making reforms that will send kids to school is because when they send kids to school, they want them to become educated about their civic responsibility in society. They want educated people showing up and making decisions at the voting booths. They want people to have a basic understanding of certain mathematical, philosophical, linguistic mastery, okay? Those kinds of things. And so there are laws that are created first in Germany, actually, in the 1870s, but then in England and France shortly thereafter, creating compulsory education for students to show up to school, just like you guys did today, because it's legally mandated that you show up to school. And you go to school for a certain amount of time. Now, since 1900, education has really come a long ways in a weird way, in some ways, and then in other ways hasn't. I guess that's kind of a complex statement to say. What I mean is this. It's kind of weird, for example, that we still have summer vacation. I'm not complaining about it. Don't get me wrong. I enjoy summer vacation, but it is kind of weird because it's like, you know, realistically, the whole idea of summer vacation was, well, we don't want kids in school in the summertime because most of them work on farms and they need to like help their parents harvest the crops or whatever, you know. You kids aren't harvesting crops in the summer, you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of a weird thing. But at the same time, the amount that you are taught in the school while you're in school is so far beyond what was taught 100 years ago, much less even like 50 years ago, much less 100 years ago. So the thing is that I couldn't even, for example, my grandma, she passed away a number of years ago, but when she was in high school, she graduated high school, which is uncommon for a woman of her time, especially from northern Minnesota. So she graduated high school in, I think, like 1952, something like that, and was uncommon. But the thing that was kind of weird about it is that even though she was a high school graduate, and she was super proud of the fact that she was a woman and got a high school education from a rural area in the 1950s, no less, she never would have been taught things like calculus, you know, in school, or AP chemistry or something, you know what I'm saying? Like, so the amount of stuff that is taught in schools these days, the amount of pressure really that's put on kids, and then two, these days there's a lot of issues surrounding like the amount of education that you need to do certain jobs. So, for example, for my job, as a teacher, I needed a bachelor's degree first. Then I needed to go back to school after I graduated with my bachelor's degree and get a credential in teaching. So that was another year and a half of college. And then I also ended up going back again and I got my master's degree so that I could teach up at Norco. But, you know, that's a whole lot of education. Realistically, these days, kids are spending a whole lot of time in school before you ever even start to become financially independent and able to like take care of yourself and pay your bills and so on and so forth, and a lot of times requires you to go into a whole lot of debt. So we can say safely that since this time, compulsory education has turned into what has basically contributed to an even greater growing gap between those people that can actually afford to go to college in nicer parts of the world versus places where people will never even finish their secondary education in poorer parts of the world. It's complex, but significant increase in literacy at this time. Men had higher rates of literacy than women did. Urbanites, people who lived in cities, had higher rates of literacy than folks who lived in rural areas, and that actually created a dynamic for a while where folks, maybe even still today, where folks from rural areas are looked at as like less educated or backwoods or yokels or something. Higher literacy rates occurred in Northern and Western Europe, Britain, France, Germany, than, say, Eastern Europe, like Russia or the Balkans somewhere in the southeast. Girls had less access to secondary education than boys, but the numbers of schools for girls do increase in the late 1800s, but families were often required to pay the cost, and the only likelihood as a girl, if you wanted to go to get a secondary education, a high school education, would be if you came from a family that had enough wealth to send you to a school like that. But one of the advantages was, and this is kind of messed up, but it's true, because back in these days, there's still a lot of that was another thing we talked about this morning in the lectures, is gender roles. In the late 1800s, there were some very distinct gender roles that had been developed, and in this time, women getting an education was seen as a way of improving your prospect to find a husband in a higher social class, who would then, interestingly enough, be the person who was expected to be the breadwinner, even though you had yourself an education. The thing is that's so sad about it is, like, you would think that a girl going to school and getting an education would be because it's like, I want to become a neurosurgeon or what, but instead it's like, I'm going to school because I want to find a husband. And it's like, well, that's not really, you know what I'm saying? It's kind of like not the reason to go to school, but in these days, very much the case. Scientific ideas and changes in science. To many, science became almost a religion. We talked about this a little bit this morning. Louis Pasteur, pasteurization, Joseph Lister. You've probably heard of Listerine before. I talk a little bit about that. It's basically just stuff that cuts down on bacterial infections and antiseptics being used in surgeries and stuff like that. Periodic table of elements, I talked about that a little bit this morning, and Auguste Comte, father of sociology, we talked about this morning as well. Charles Darwin. Just to go on a little bit more of a rant about Charles Darwin. Darwin's ideas are often applied to this other thing called social Darwinism, but the thing about that is that they're not really the same thing. Social Darwinism, as opposed to, like, Charles Darwin was talking about naturalism. So when he went and observed different kind of animal species who had adapted to the particular environment in which they live, right? Social Darwinism is taking this idea of survival of the fittest, the idea that strong animals survive and weak animals perish, okay? And applying it to humans and saying, well, it's okay if Europeans have imperialist attitudes, which is a big part of this unit that we're in right now, is imperialism, the idea that these empires are going and taking over new places in Africa or Asia or wherever. And it's okay if people do that because of social Darwinism. If we take Darwin's ideas and apply it to humans, that just means that some humans are stronger than others, and others are destined to die off, just like the dodo bird or whatever. Okay, and so that if you can understand, I mean, that's like a really harsh, cruel, and cold world to live in. It's very lacking in compassion, right? Because there are some people that, like, by no fault of their own, are in conditions that made it very easy for Europeans to go in and essentially take them over. But the other side of it gets to if you take social Darwinism to an extreme, the other side of it is it excuses things like genocide, right? Because in Hitler's version of the world back in World War II, white Germans, the Aryan race, so-called Aryan race, was the most pure of the races, and other races were less pure and needed to be cleansed, that is, killed, okay? And this is social Darwinism taken to an extreme, and so it's not a very good way of running a society. Social Darwinism is really very, very bad, actually, and all of this stuff that social Darwinism was based on is pseudoscience. It's not, like, for example, the study of eugenics. Eugenics sounds like genetics, kind of, but it's a hokey science. It's not like a real thing. And so, but it sounds real. That's the thing that's scary about it. So when people hear something that's like, well, oh boy, purity of bloodlines, they start thinking like this is an actual thing, and then before long, you're condoning either discriminating or treating other people prejudicially, or outright murdering them, as with the Holocaust, in the name of racial superiority. And that's basically social Darwinism and white man's burden are kind of very similar topics in the age of imperialism, which we're going to be talking more about as we go throughout the rest of this unit here. So the guy that came up with social Darwinism is this guy, Herbert Spencer. And he took Darwin's theory and applied it to human society, essentially, saying that natural laws dictated why certain people were successful and others were not. And this, of course, was later used by imperialists to justify the conquest of so-called weaker peoples. and used by industrialists to justify their health. And these ideas became very popular amongst the middle class. Okay, Sigmund Freud. I did briefly mention Sigmund Freud this morning. I got farther on this than I thought that I did. It's because third period's just a little bit behind where you guys are, that's why. But Sigmund Freud was an Austrian physician. He was Jewish, actually. And he was considered one of the three giants of the late 19th century thought. With Darwin and Marx. And Sigmund Freud, the reason that his ideas were so impactful isn't so much because today we're like, boy, Freud's like, we believe everything that Freud says. That's not so much to do with that. Freud is a guy who has historical significance because it's the first time that that people started to think of the human mind as being more irrational than rational. So what Freud suggested is that what you have to understand is this is coming off the heels of the Enlightenment, which had been like the guiding force for intellectual understanding of people for the last century or more. People were thinking like, after Newton, well, the world is supremely rational, everything's explainable, everything has a known quantifiable solution, everything can be explained through science or through reason, right? And like Freud coming in the late 1800s and then too continuing his work into the interwar period after World War I, really put a spotlight on how irrational humans can be. You have these groups that, if you really stop and think about it on a basic level, you have these people in Europe who have viewed themselves as being, they're the civilized ones. They're the ones whose responsibility it is to go and literally like lighten, and I use that both in a racial context, but also in an intellectual one, enlighten other regions of the world outside of Europe, make them more European. And these Europeans look at themselves as these supremely rational thinking beings who are Christian and who are civilized and who are use reason and so much farther ahead in their industrial advanced and all these other things. They look at themselves as superior people. And then World War I happens. And if you ever have looked into the causes of World War I, they're ridiculous. The whole war, like the war itself is insane because you're looking at this war of like, it's the assassination of an archduke of a dying empire, and then another empire basically pledges its loyalty to support the one, Austria-Hungary, whose archduke had been assassinated. Germany says, we have your back. Germany ends up creating war with Britain and France, and it drags all of these people in. Britain and France had nothing to do with whatever was going on in Austria. The whole thing is absurd. But everybody gets pulled into this war in Europe. They fight for 4 long years in the worst conditions anyone has ever seen. Because it's the first time that modern technology has been applied to warfare on such a massive scale. So they have machine guns that are just tearing into people, shrapnel bombs, poison gas that leaves people like disfigured. It's horrible. And they come home from this with new mental illnesses that people hadn't seen before, shell shock, which now we call post-traumatic stress disorder, and all sorts of different things that people had never seen. And they get done with it, and it's like waking up from a fever dream. People are looking like, what happened? What happened? This is like, I thought we were reasonable, and we just fought this war for 4 years for what? For what? For nothing. It seemingly was so the whole war was seemingly so senseless. So Freud's ideas about humans not being as rational as perhaps they think they are, really coincide with World War I, where people have to take a hard look in the mirror and say, like, never mind burning the house down, we just burned the entire neighborhood down. And what do we have to show for it but a bunch of people who are coming back unwrapped, or mentally or physically traumatized, and then many people who never came back. 10 million people lost their lives in World War I. It was catastrophically traumatic, and again, ripping these dynasties apart that had been in place for so long. Freud's ideas all of a sudden start to make a little more sense. Maybe people do things that they don't know why they do them. Maybe there are hidden motives that they're not even aware of themselves. What he called unconscious drives, okay? And many of Freud's ideas revolved around, and this is why Freud gets discounted as a scientific figure rather than valuing him for his historical stuff. Not a super scientific guy, problematic in many ways, very sexist, very male-centric in his research, and also not very scientifically sound protocols for his research. So from a psychological level, you probably won't hear a lot of people defending Freudian psychology as an avenue of psychological study, but nonetheless gets people thinking about stuff that happens with society. And so, and then changes in physics I mentioned, just briefly, Max Planck quantum theory, Albert Einstein, clearly probably the most significant figure in physics outside of perhaps Stephen Hawking, who just recently passed away a few years ago. But in 1905, so let's just talk a little bit about Einstein. At the same time that Freud is coming out with all of his ideas surrounding the unconscious mind, the so-called unconscious mind, people doing things where they don't really even have their own understanding of why they're doing them. At the very same time that that's happening, another way in which European understandings of the world was being ripped apart was by Albert Einstein, who basically completely ripped apart Newtonian physics. So Principia, Isaac Newton's Principia, which talked about all of the laws of motion that we learned about at the tail end of the Enlightenment period. Albert Einstein came out with this whole new understanding called the Theory of Relativity. The Theory of Relativity. Allow me to put my physics hat on. Yes, Manaya, I can. Allow me to put my physics teacher hat on. Trust me, it's a hat that does not fit as well as the history teacher hat does, but the physics teacher hat. So this is kind of briefly the best way that I can describe theory of relativity. Basically, because the speed of light is constant, according to Albert Einstein, all right, that means that time and space are relative. So what does this mean? To give you an example of a practical application of Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, we think of time as constant. We can't change how fast a second ticks by, right? A second is a second, no matter what, right? No, not according to Albert Einstein. According to Albert Einstein, because time and space are actually relative according to the speed of light, let's say that you were to get into a spaceship that had capabilities of traveling at or near the speed of light. It doesn't even have to go the full speed of light, but let's say it can go a third of the speed of light. You hop up in this spaceship and you take a month-long trip traveling at 1/3 of the speed of light in orbit around Earth, right? You following me so far? Here's what would happen. You've got a watch, okay? You've got a watch. You put your watch on your wrist, and you can see the seconds ticking on the watch, okay? The watch will continue ticking seconds just as it always does, all right? You're up there for 1 full month watching your watch tick by, okay? You come back down to Earth, decades, perhaps even more, will have passed. Okay? Decades will have gone by for everybody else around you because you were going so fast, time slowed down for you. Okay? This is called time dilation. And it's an actual thing. They've measured it. It's not just a made-up fairy tale thing. It's an actual thing. They have taken and measured using atomic clocks, which are very, very, very precise clocks, certain isotopes that decay at a predictable rate that shoot down from the stratosphere. And they have measured the decay of these isotopes based on how fast they were being shot down from the stratosphere. And the ones that are traveling faster decay slower. And so this is how they know that time dilation is actually a thing. So gravity is another way in which time can change. If you ever saw the movie Interstellar, they play on the theory of time dilation in that movie when they land on a massive planet that has a ton of gravity. And they're only on the planet for a few hours, but when they go back up to the ship, years and years have passed by, and no one's heard from them. So this kind of an interesting concept, right? Pretty cool. So, but this is what Albert Einstein comes up with. And of course, once again, as if the world needed any other evidence of things to make them feel uncertain about, tearing apart the one thing that like binded everything together about the Enlightenment, which was Isaac Newton's Principia, was probably the last thing that they really needed. But it's really important because, oddly enough, you know, these discoveries came amidst one of the most uncertain, chaotic times in global history. And it's kind of neat, in my view, that with all of the uncertainty and anxiety floating about as a result of World War I, as a result of all of the changing cultural and technological innovations that were happening during this time, there were great pieces of beauty in art and literature that came out of this time. You know, even though the destruction of World War I and kind of the fabric of society being torn apart you would think kind of be depressing for everyone. Oddly enough, amazing, great works and then music's the other side. Jazz music emerges during this age. Cubism, Pablo Picasso, Surrealism, Salvador Dali, all these amazing pieces, creative pieces, coming out of this era in the early 1900s here. So his famous thing, E equals mc squared, matter and energy are interchangeable. Even a particle of matter contains enormous levels of potential energy, is basically what he says. And the impact of new scientific theories on the European mind. Darwinism further challenged the Bible's account of the creation of humans, of course, because basically Darwin's saying that creatures on Earth, whether they be humans or anything else, take millions of years to evolve. And this seemingly and quite literally contradicts the verbiage in the Old Testament of the Bible. And then Freudian psychology undermined the belief that humans were rational beings that were in control of their emotions, which in many cases people are not, you know. So, and then the impact of the new physics that comes out during this age is that it shattered the popular belief that the universe could be easily explained via Newtonian physics, and scientists realized that they knew less about the universe than they previously thought that they did. So, this uncertainty later fed the pessimism of European society in the wake of World War I, which we've been kind of talking about here. And then what else do I have in this PowerPoint? I am going to divert from this PowerPoint briefly because a lot of this is just art now at the end of this. So I'm actually going to divert from that, and I'm going to upload this one. to Canvas. All right, Age of Mass Politics. And then I'm going to check my thing here. What is this? So this one ends at 12:57. Is that right? 12:57. Okay, I'm still getting used. We only got like a handful of minutes here, then, but that's okay. We will just briefly start. Oops, yeah, there we go. All right. Age of Mass Politics. So, sometimes they call the 19th century the long 19th century, and the reason that they call it the long 19th century is because we usually say that the start of I should probably use that, but anyway, the start of the 19th century is like the start of the French Revolution, they say a lot of times, 1789. And then the end of the 19th century, they say, comes with the start of World War I, which is 1914. So the reason that sometimes they call the 1800s the long 19th century is because the trends of it kind of start with the French Revolution and end with World War I, which kind of spills over into the 20th century on the other side. So let's talk a little bit about the theme of this period, the national state. The national state. Previous to this, we had really been kind of thinking about the geopolitical structure of Europe as being empires. So you got the British Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire, and so on. Now we're starting to move into an era of nation states, and the national state created a common framework in European politics where political parties began dominating politics. We see increased suffrage. You guys know what suffrage is? You guys know what that is? Suffrage? Voting rights? Yeah. Voting rights. Increased suffrage. So in case anyone ever comes up to you and asks you to sign a petition that says, end women's suffrage. Women's suffrage has been going on way too long. They are not talking about suffering, right? Don't fall for it. All right, increased suffrage, which means people have the right to vote. Increased literacy in Western and Central European nations during the late 19th century resulted in higher expectations and demands among the people for the government to be responsive to their needs. So one of the reasons that we have this movement towards a more democratic society at this time is precisely because people are becoming better educated and demanding to have a voice in government, and a government that is representative of the people. Now, the extent to which the government is actually representative of the people is something that we could sit and debate until the cows come home. On one hand, not really, because if you take a look at government, number one, it's mostly extremely old people. Number two, most of them are men. Number three, most of them have advanced college degrees, which most people don't have. I think only 7% of people in the United States have like a master's degree or more. Most of them have law degrees. Most of them are white, and so on and so forth. So if we're looking at our own government, the extent to which the government is, on a demographic level at least, representative of the people, it's not very, if we're being completely honest. However, it is getting closer in recent years, which is, I think, probably a good thing. But the other side of it being the wealth side of it. And so, back in the early 1800s, when we were talking about Parliament and the rotten boroughs and stuff like that, Parliament was really, really not at all representative of the vast majority of the population. And there was an acute awareness building up by the working classes that the government just had absolutely no interest in helping them out whatsoever. In fact, quite the opposite. You know, the Chartist movement failed and stuff like that. And then also you have the other problem, which is that the society is changing at this time and urbanizing, and these changes of the Industrial Revolution ultimately caused problems that became impossible to ignore, and we'll continue talking about that when we get more into Age of Mass Politics next time. All right, guys. Thanks so much for stopping in today. And I'll be seeing you, every Tuesday at this time, right? Or I mean every Monday at this time. Yeah, very good. All right. Make good decisions. Yep, have a great one. Yep, see ya.